This episode is sponsored in part by World Relief, the Christian humanitarian organization we trust to tackle some of the world's biggest problems. In the last couple of years, increased conflict around the world, the lingering effects of COVID-19, and disasters caused by our changing climate have left millions of people in desperate situations. My friends at World Relief, together with their monthly partners, are walking alongside people in vulnerable situations every step of the way. To learn more about World Relief or say yes to joining the PATH community as a monthly partner, visit worldrelief.org/holypost. That's worldrelief.org/holypost. The problems are big. Let's tackle them together with World Relief today.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Holy Post. Some of you know that I've been writing a series of books for the last few years called What If Jesus Was Serious? The basic premise is that the problems Christians are facing today in our society aren't because we take Jesus too seriously, but because we don't take him seriously enough. That's definitely not true of my guest today. My friend Shane Claiborne is an author, an activist, and a speaker, and while plenty of people may disagree with him, no one would accuse him of not taking Jesus seriously. In fact, he leads Red Letter Christians, a movement of people committed to living as if Jesus actually meant the things he said. And that's the spirit you find in his latest book, Rethinking Life, Embracing the Sacredness of Every Person. Shane argues that our current political divisions do not align with what Jesus, the Bible, or the early church believed about the sanctity of life. He argues compellingly against abortion, but he also says a Christian ethic of life must go further to combating racism, poverty, the death penalty, and other dehumanizing evils. As you'll hear in our conversation, even when Christians agree on the value of life, how this gets applied practically and in policy is where things can get tricky. And it's one thing for a tiny church on the margins of society to apply Jesus' teachings, but how do Christians apply his words when they have control of the government and armies? It's a great conversation, and be sure to stick around because after my interview with Shane Claiborne, I'm joined by Phil and Christian to debrief the conversation as we continue to wrestle with the implications of being consistently pro-life in today's world. One quick announcement before we begin. There's a brand new episode of Christian Asks now available exclusively for Holy Post supporters. So be sure to check that out. And if you're not yet a supporter, you are missing out. We have exclusive shows, bonus interviews with our guests, live streams with me and Phil, the Holy Post Book Club, and free merchandise. If you want the full, unfiltered Holy Post experience, you need to sign up and join us where the real fun is happening. So go to holypost.com and click Support Us today. Okay, here's my interview with Shane Claiborne.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post.
Shane Claiborne, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. Always good.
I miss talking to you. We have such great conversations. I want to start with not a great conversation, which is just we happen to be recording this after a weekend of protests around the country following the release of the video of the police beating of Tyre Nichols, which eventually 3 days after that he died. I just want to get your thoughts on this. And I know there's still a lot of details to come out. Protests are calling for different things. How are you reading this story right now? And given your work and this new book on life, how does this tragic story fit into what you are advocating for?
Well, first of all, I think so many of us, have really heavy hearts after seeing just the latest hashtag and death of Tyre. I mean, I was in Tennessee speaking. That's my home state, so it, particularly feels close. And I was with a group of dozens and dozens of pastors from the state of Tennessee. And what was encouraging was to feel the holy outrage, the grief, the fatigue of this happening again. And what I've chosen to do, on socials and stuff like that is really to celebrate who Tyre Nichols was, and such a fascinating young man, and the way that he welcomed people into the skate park, and his interest in photography and sunsets and the farm, and things, so people can just see his that he was someone's child. I mean, his last words were crying out to his mother. But the contrast of the force and the dehumanizing, desecrating force of the police in that situation. I mean, that's exactly why I wrote Rethinking Life, is because I think we need to rethink a lot of things. And one of them is the way that we do policing in our country. And the history, that this is not divorced from our history of how policing has its roots in really the subjugation of African American lives, and many folks are going to say that this has evolved and it's different because they were black police officers. But the truth is that we've got a policing crisis in our country, and this is just the latest evidence of that. And Skye, one other thing too is that it's hard for us to stay tuned in to all of the things happening in our country, but many of us haven't even moved on from the mass shootings that were, back to back in California and several in other places in the country that maybe didn't even make the news. And 3 executions in 3 different states. We're barely a month into this new year. So that's why I wrote the book, I think we need a fresh appreciation of the sacredness of human life, and that every person's made in the image of God. And if that's our starting point, I think it could change some things.
Amen. You and I have talked in the past about gun violence and the work you're doing on that front. And this book tackles a lot of different pieces of this issue. And I wanted to begin with the Tyre Nichols case, because this is one of those instances where in prior police shootings or police actions like this, there were calls for reform on tactics or accountability. And it feels like in this case, a lot of the things that had been advocated for in other parts of the country were already in place. For example, these police officers had body cameras. There was immediate accountability. The chief fired them as soon as this incident came to her knowledge. They're being indicted for murder, whereas in other cases, it took a long time for there to be any real accountability. And yet, all those things being true, there's still a young black man dead. And it wasn't enough to deter this action from happening in the first place. So for those of us who think, well, we need a policy change, we need a law change, we need some kind of top-down institutional realignment, it feels like there's something deeper going on here, that there's a cultural change that needs to happen in policing and perhaps more broadly in the country. But how do we do that?
Yeah.
Because so many of us feel like if you have a hammer in your hand, it's legislation and everything's a nail and you just go that route. But you're calling for something broader than just legislation.
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, we shouldn't have to catch it on tape to have justice or even account. I don't even think that we have to distinguish too between accountability and justice. And accountability is simply being held responsible for really terrible, tragic decisions like killing someone. But justice would be Tyre Nichols alive, right? Like, that's what we're going for. And so I think we do need a comprehensive rethinking of policing in our country. The wild thing is this has been going on year after year after year, just like the mass shootings. We're here again. There are lots of things that I think we could do, and some of them there was a bipartisan task force under the Obama administration that identified, I think, some really good strategic moves that we could make. One of the things I think we could do is have an emergency response group that is especially trained as social workers, in de-escalation. They're trained in addiction. They're trained in mental health. And they're another form of first responders. So in our neighborhood, police and firefighters, EMTs are responding to all kinds of things. A lot of them are overdoses. So they're, giving Narcan to folks that are overdosing from heroin. And there's just so many different things. So I think if we had an emergency response unit that is trained in de-escalation, trained in mental health, trained in addiction. That could help. It could help broaden the burden, but also more properly respond to folks. Now, this is different from Tyre's case. I just think in comprehensive, like rethinking of policing. Another thing is that we need accountability outside of police for police officers and law enforcement officers. So community-based, objective, like boards where block captains and leaders, pastors in the neighborhood, other faith leaders could be a part of this to show, because we've had cases, Skye. I mean, some of the scariest stuff I've ever experienced in my neighborhood has involved police. And it shouldn't be that way. I grew up in East Tennessee with a very different perspective of policing that has changed, as my kind of environment changed. But we had police officers that were driving the wrong way on a one-way street. I would imagine responding to some emergency, but they had an accident and severely wounded a toddler. And so the neighborhood was really upset about that. And they came in cussing and yelling, and they ended up handcuffing and arresting some of the neighbors and family members of the toddler. So this is just, it kept spiraling, right? We had other officers that were responding to a case of a homeless man with mental health struggles, and we were trying to get him to go into a hospital. And they started yelling at him, calling him a piece of, I don't know if I can say it on your show, Skye, but they're telling him terrible things, right? And they're like attacking him, and you're like, this guy needs help. He doesn't need to be beaten up, right? We had 10, 15 people that witnessed that, and we filed a case, and it came back unfounded. And the only reason, and what they told us is, sorry you didn't catch it on film. You needed to have a camera there. And we're like, that's messed up, right? We all experience it. So, I think there's so many layers of this, bro. But, when people are saying defund the police, this has become, a big cultural war. And I think what a lot of folks are saying is that we need to reallocate funds, that right now some like half of our city budgets are going towards very ineffective policing. We need to rethink some things, and we've got the resources. And if we can just have the willpower, we can do better. And I think some lives like Tyre's might be saved if our police are not coming aggressively armed in every situation. A lot of countries I've been to, the police aren't even armed unless they need an armed response unit. So you shouldn't be pulling someone off, on a traffic stop with your guns blazing. We've seen this story over and over and over.
Yeah, well, two different things there. One is as some of the fabric of our society breaks down, especially in highly populated areas, and there's more and more problems with drug addiction and the plethora of issues that are happening, it feels like a lot of our response is, well, we just need to fund the police more and let the police deal with this. And as you're putting it, like, the police aren't necessarily the right people to be engaging every one of these problems. We need a variety of responses rather than one size fits all. And then secondly, your idea that maybe the police don't need to be armed for every thing that they're involved in. Well, I agree with you, but that gets incredibly more complicated and difficult when you have over 400 million guns floating around this country. So normally, you're right, in a traffic stop, a police officer shouldn't need to be armed. But if you now suspect that the person you're pulling over is probably armed themselves, it raises and increases the threat level. And so now everyone is armed, and you increase the likelihood of a violent and perhaps deadly exchange. So it feels like we're on this death spiral. This, in the nuclear war field, we call it MAD, mutually assured destruction, where everyone just is armed to the teeth, and the only deterrent is that we're all armed, and therefore no one does anything. But that doesn't work on a personal level. All this fits into the theme of your book, Rethinking Life, embracing the sacredness of every person. This is a profound book, and it's a disturbing book, and I wish I could make it required reading for everybody in our audience, and certainly everyone in the church. Not everyone's going to agree with everything you say in here, but it's an education. Let's talk about, I want to begin in chapter 6, which is a bit into the book. You have this chapter, let me get there. It's called The Early Church Was a Force for Life. And there's some history in here that a lot of Christians aren't aware of, but you build this really fascinating case based on the writings of the early church fathers especially, that the church had this consistent ethic of life that didn't emphasize certain things and not others. At one point you say this: no Christian writing before Constantine in the 4th century argues that there is any circumstance in which a Christian may kill. Talk a little bit about your own discovery of the early church's ethic of life and how that transformed your views.
Yeah, well, I've always loved reading the early Christians. There's something just so fresh and energetic and innocent about this, early movement of revolutionary movement of folks that were risking their lives to follow Jesus. And as you read their writings, one of the things that you see is they were a peculiar force in the Roman Empire, and they were misunderstood. People called them cannibals because they, ate the body and drank the blood of Jesus. It was weird for a lot of people. They were called. A lot of people thought they were incestual because everybody called each other brother and sister indiscriminately, and they said, no, we share everything in common except for our spouses. That's what Tertullian said. So, but they did. There was this radical sense of we're sisters and brothers because we've been born again. And that really changes the way that we think about everybody. And one of the things that, and they were also considered enemies of the state. They were proclaiming allegiance to another king named Jesus, not Caesar. But one of the threads that you see is this advocacy for life that was comprehensive, that had so many different beautiful manifestations, right? They spoke out against the gladiatorial games because they thought that was this sick cultural glamorization of violence. And they spoke out against military combat and said, how can we love our enemies and simultaneously prepare to kill them? They spoke against the death penalty very passionately and talked about how Jesus died for folks that, to make sure everybody has a chance at redemption. I mean, all this. So it was so powerful. And, some people leave out that they did talk about abortion. And many folks point out that the Bible doesn't really speak to abortion. Jesus doesn't mention it, but it did exist 2,000 years ago. Even a lot of Christians I write about in the book that we would now, kind of associate with the religious right, like James Dobson and Jerry Falwell. Many of them were really ambiguous on abortion. It wasn't really a primary issue for them. But the early Christians did write about it, and consistently they spoke against abortion, and it was called exposure, where basically you leave a kid in the woods or in the desert, So it's not it's a little apples and oranges to some of the ways that we think about abortion. But the point is that they were passionate about life, and they had this deep conviction that every person is an image bearer of God. Every person is made in the image of God. And that meant that they wanted to stand against violence in every iteration that it had.
We'll get into the abortion stuff a little bit later, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into how this was applied in the early centuries of the church and some of the ambiguities and what it means for us today. And in particular, you have this really, and this is a question that's bothered me for a long time, is how did the early church deal with soldiers? And the reason it bothers me is because it's something that comes up a number of times in the New Testament. John the Baptist talks to Roman soldiers. Jesus has interactions with Roman soldiers, sometimes incredibly positive ones, like the centurion. The apostles had interactions with Roman soldiers, like Cornelius with Peter. And in all those circumstances, whether it's Jesus or John or the apostles, none of them call the soldiers to leave their posts in order to follow Jesus. And yet the early church understood that there was something inconsistent with a Christian ethic of life and being part of the army. So one quote you have in here from Origen, this is 2nd, 3rd century, Jesus nowhere teaches that it is right for his own disciples to offer violence to anyone, however wicked, for we no longer take up sword against nation, nor do we learn war anymore, having become children of peace for the sake of Jesus. So there was this general attitude in the early church that you couldn't really be a soldier and be a follower of Jesus, at least not a soldier that engages in warfare.
That's a really important distinction, Skye, and it was something that they understood, right? Is that there's a difference between being willing to kill someone and serving in the military. So a Christian, someone who was going to be baptized, was going to dedicate their life to Jesus, they could stay in the military as long as they made a commitment not to kill. That might sound weird to us, but this is a time where the Roman military was building aqueducts and roads. There was all kinds of infrastructure. So it was very, conceivable for someone to be in a non-combat role in the military. But there was no debate around whether or not a Christian could kill. And in fact, that was so clear, in all of their teaching. And then it became, there was a kind of a crossroads to where can you be in the military and make a commitment not to kill? And I think that's where a lot of soldiers, even to this day, find themselves really in a difficult place to make this commitment to love our enemy for the sake of Christ and simultaneously be prepared to kill their enemies. It becomes really hard. I've, know so many soldiers and veterans that have wrestled with that in combat.
Let's go a little deeper here, because in the same chapter, you talk about Hippolytus in 2:18, talking about if a person seeking baptism, quote, wore the purple robe, that meant that they were part of the Roman magistrate and carried out executions for the Roman government, they needed to leave their job. So here's my question. I mean, you talked about this a little bit already, but in the early church it was understood that a Christian could not directly themselves kill. But there was also this prohibition against being part of the apparatus that kills. If you were a Roman magistrate, that was like you couldn't stay in that role, even if you were not the one swinging the sword. You were still part of the apparatus that led to the execution of people, and that you could not do.
Yeah.
So here's my question: how far removed from a system of devaluing life do we need to be as Christians in order to be clear of conscience? For example, I fly pretty regularly. I fly a lot, and you may travel a lot too. Most of the time, I'm flying on a Boeing airplane. When I buy a ticket on Southwest or American or United, whatever, I am supporting Boeing as a company. They're one of the largest defense contractors in the world. They create the drones that kill, innocent people at times. So do I need to not fly because Boeing is engaged in warfare? Or as an American, can I be elected to political office and be a member of Congress that has to vote on war? Does that indict me as a Christian? So and this gets really ethically ambiguous, where what does it mean to really be removed from a system of evil in a globalized economy where I can shop at Walmart and buy something, and I don't know if I'm perpetuating evil and injustice. I'm talking to you right now on a Mac computer. We know that Apple has employed, nefarious labor practices in parts of China that have hurt people. So what does it mean to not be indicted as part of this ethic of death as a Christian?
Yeah, man, we're getting into it now. Well, so this is, you start to see why so many Christians also withdrew from the dominant culture and went to the desert to build a new society in the shell of the old one. We still have, traditions like the Anabaptists and many of the monastic communities that are trying to do some of that work. So I feel that, I think the question for us is, as Christians is, what would Jesus do? And it's a really tricky one. Would Jesus, fly on a Boeing jet? Would Jesus use an Apple computer? But I think what we do have to have is this sensitivity to the harm that's done. And until it becomes real to us, there's not that urgency. That's why I started making my own clothes, was because I actually was at a rally that had brought in some of the children and the workers from sweatshops, and it wrecked me, man. I don't know how to make socks and boxers yet, so I'm still, I think we're all trying to be a little less complicit with the things that are hurting people's lives. And we certainly need grace as we do that, because we live, in this broken world. But there are some really powerful ways that we can interrupt the systems of death. For instance, the death penalty has so many different layers that try to create anonymity. So there's, a jury, there's a judge, there's a parole and pardons board, there's the governor that signs a death warrant, there's a death team that's often brought in from outside the prison so that they don't know any of the prisoners that they're having to kill. There's medical teams. So people are starting to not comply. They decide, I don't want to be a part of that. So in North Carolina, the doctors and nurses said, we took an oath to do no harm. we are not going to participate in carrying out executions. And the Medical Association backed them up, and it stopped executions, right? So I think I have a friend, Adam Luck, in Oklahoma, who was governor appointed to the Pardon and Parole Board. And he, as a Christian, started to really wrestle with the brokenness of the system, also with his faith, believing that someone's more than the worst thing that they've ever done. And he voted against executions and was asked to step down from that parole board. And now he is a voice of a Christian with a conscience in Oklahoma. And so, I think that's kind of what I would say. There's all kinds of ways that we are complicit, but what does it mean to, for each of us to try to be less of a hypocrite today than we were yesterday? That's what I'm going for. And, Cyprian, one of the folks that I quote in the book, he was a bishop, and he said, isn't it interesting that when an individual kills another individual, we call it evil, as we should. But when the state does it in mass, we sort of sanctify it, and we call it we call it justice. We call it good. When the state kills, when we would never allow for an individual to kill. And he really makes this powerful connection that it is wrong to kill, whether it's done by a criminal on the street or by a governor or a president or a king. It's always wrong to kill, whether it's a state or an individual.
So it's a powerful quote, and it raises all kinds of fascinating Christian ethical dilemmas. So let me ask you this straight up. Do you think a Christian can be a police officer?
I think if a Christian is going to be a police officer, they've got to take their commitment to Jesus more seriously than their affiliation with their job. And this was
that should be true of any Christian in any job.
It should be. And that's what's interesting about that. When people were being baptized, and they said, if you're wearing the purple robe, you need to step down. They didn't stop there. They said, if you work in the brothels,
right.
So I think we can say there's all kinds of careers or jobs that might not line up with our commitment to Jesus. And in fact, being a follower of Jesus might make us a really bad police officer in some standards, or a really bad soldier. So I think the desire, if we're seeking first the kingdom of God, I think each of us can ask, how can we best participate in that? I've got friends right here. I've got a friend right across the street that's a police officer, and he's wrestling with this. And there comes a point for a lot of folks where they feel like, I cannot be true to who I am or who Christ has called me to be in this particular role. Whether that's, owning a porn shop, or working for Boeing or Lockheed Martin, or maybe it's working for the Scorpion unit of the police down in Memphis, or whatever it is. Or, it's participating in some layer of the systems of state executions. I think there's all kinds of ways that we can feel that collision. And that's where the call of Jesus, Jesus couldn't be much clearer, right? That this comes at a cost. If you're going to be my disciple, you got to be willing to lay down your life. You got to be willing to give up your career. So I think in all of our seeker sensitivity in much of the evangelical church, we've sacrificed and cheapened, the cost of discipleship, to use Bonhoeffer's words.
So one of the more remarkable parts of your book that I found really thoughtful and helpful is you talk about the early church and its consistent ethic of life. But those early Christians had, in a weird way, the advantage of really being on the periphery, right? They were a minority. They were persecuted. They didn't generally have seats of power in the Roman Empire. All that changes with Constantine. And you have this great look at that shift of how Constantine centered Christianity. And for the first time, Christians had to wrestle with, well, what does it mean for us to actually have real power and follow Jesus? And that's where you get the development of things like just war theory and all kinds of other compromises with the ethic of life that Jesus gave us in order to really run an empire. And you make the case, and I think quite convincingly, that when Christians have proximity to power, they end up compromising on the ethics of Jesus. Apart from that, historically, how do you see that happening today? And I want to challenge you a little bit, because I think you and I could both have a great conversation about ways this is happening on the political right. I'd be curious to hear how you see it happening on the political left.
Yeah, absolutely, dude. So, I mean, it is wild as you look at the trajectory of early Christianity to see this shift from the persecuted to the persecutors. From the folks that carried the cross to then they're exchanging the cross for the sword. But I'm building on other folks' work here, like Dave Gushy, who really I think helps name that too. That this was not just about numbers. It wasn't just that they were becoming a majority of the population, but it was that proximity to power.
Right.
That's really what changed. And Constantine changed that significantly by sort of declaring that this was going to be a part of the Roman culture. It's going to be accepted. And then to begin tearing down the worship spaces of folks that weren't Christian, all that stuff. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned, but I mean, going back to Jesus, what good is it to gain the whole world and forfeit our soul? And I think that's what began to happen and still continues to happen. What we forfeit our soul for might be different. I think there are a lot of folks that, like in the Gospels, betray Jesus with a kiss for a few seats on the Supreme Court. And we lose our soul. We forfeit our integrity in order to defend things that are indefensible to gain more and more power. I think you point out rightfully that this can happen. It's not a partisan thing; it's a power thing, and so I think that I see folks that are compromising on moral convictions in order to get a seat at the table on the left and the right, that are also quiet on some things that matter because it's unpopular with their peers of their political persuasion on things that they disagree with. So, as my friend Reverend Barber says, that some of this is not about left and right, it's about right and wrong. And that's why, we have to keep centered on Jesus, because Jesus is a kind of moral framework for how I think about these things. And like, for instance, immigration, Skye, let's kind of, that's an interesting one, because Jesus said, when you welcome the stranger, you welcome me. The New Testament says, when you welcome the foreigner, you might be entertaining angels unaware. The Old Testament says, welcome the foreigner as if they were your own flesh and blood. All this. So this is one of the holiest things that we can do, is show compassion and hospitality to refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants. And what's interesting is, some of our highest numbers of refugees and immigrants have been welcomed under Republican presidents. No matter who's been president in the last few years, our immigration policies are almost unchangeable at this point. So I think that this is one of those things that should not be a partisan thing. It should be a Jesus thing. It should be something that Christians are championing. And that's happening to a certain degree. I'm a part of a lot of these movements fighting for immigration reform, But that's just I think one example of how we kind of think about this, and it's not a left or right thing. And if we're honest, there are Republicans that have done a better job than some of our recent presidents. And Trump did a terrible job, but some of Trump's policies are still in place under Biden.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that. I mean, it is easy when you're closer to the white evangelical community. It's easy to see their political accommodation to power on the conservative right. But we can think that, well, if we just go to the left, that's not a problem. We need to, and then there's an overcorrection, and then you get over there and you realize, oh, wait a minute. The same human instinct exists there too. When you get proximity to power on the left, it also makes people compromise or remain silent on moral convictions when your call to center on Christ is really important. Okay, before we run out of time, I want to talk about abortion. Because, I mean, really, a lot of people who pick up your book are going to have come from a white evangelical conservative environment that has elevated abortion as the litmus test, as you put in the book, for whether or not you are a pro-life Christian. And the whole point of your book is to expand our imaginations to realize that the early church and Christian ethics values life in all of its forms. But you give a whole chapter to this issue of abortion, and it actually comes up earlier in the book as well. But in your chapter on abortion, on page 188, you have this whole section that's titled "It's Complicated." And it is complicated, and you go into all the nuances and complications of this issue. This is stuff that Phil and I have talked about at length on this podcast in the past. But earlier in the book, when you talk about the early church's view of abortion, this is on page 75, this is what you write. Although the issue of abortion is virtually non-existent in the Bible, even though it was common practice in biblical times, that is not the case with the writings of the early church. Of the prominent leaders and thinkers in the early church, 8 mention abortion in 11 different writings. So some of them mention it multiple times. In every instance, they unequivocally condemn it. So here's my question. If the early church is absolutely clear on this topic, why in our modern context do you argue it's complicated?
Yeah. So the reason that I think it is complicated is because this is one of those things where there's things that we know now that were different 2,000 years ago. For instance, like leaving a baby that's been born in the wilderness to die can't be equated, I think, to like the day after pill. Even an abortion a few weeks into a pregnancy that we now know the baby is no longer living, right? Or something like that. Or even in a later part of pregnancy, we had a couple of town halls, Skye, where one young woman had twins and one of them had passed away. And so her life, the other child in her womb, or in her was at stake. Those are things that the early church wasn't wrestling with those same questions, right? But what I think that we can take from the early church is the sacredness of life. We're not all going to agree on when life begins. Does it begin at conception? Does it begin at viability? The baby can live outside the mother. Does it begin at first breath? Does it begin at heartbeat? I don't think we're going to agree on that. What I'm suggesting is that even the possibility of life is precious. And let's rally around that. If progressive folks were just as concerned about reducing the number of abortions, and conservatives as well. Like some of the things that I think would actually reduce the number of abortions, because financial viability is often the number one thing listed for the reason for having an abortion, then things like better health care and child care, parental leave, living wages, those are things that would make having a baby a little bit more viable and could reduce the number of abortions. I also critique folks that say laws are not the solution to guns, and we're talking about common sense gun laws, like limiting the capacity of, guns to shoot 10 rounds without reloading, like, just sensible stuff, like a limit to the number of handguns one person could use. And many folks are blocking those, saying laws are not going to solve it. But then on abortion, there's a contradiction. They're running towards the law to outlaw abortion in every way. So I think one of the questions I asked in the book is, what is common sense gun laws? What are common sense gun laws that would save lives? And what are common sense abortion laws that might save lives or that might have a more reasonable respect for life? I kind of mentioned the vice presidential debate where Kamala Harris was asked, is there some limit, to the abortion? And she really kind of dodged that. And Mike Pence did the same thing, people were looking for, is there maybe one case you could imagine an abortion being the option in rape or incest or something like that, or the 10-year-old girl in Ohio or wherever, it's just, so I think we need a more reasonable conversation on it, and we can have that if we really want to, and we don't kind of just default to the culture wars and the partisan politics.
I couldn't agree with you more. And like I said, we've talked about this numerous times on the podcast. Yeah, you have.
You've done a lot of great work on it, bro. Yeah.
I am in favor of any practical steps that would end up reducing the number of abortions in this country. Paid family leave, number of the other economic incentives and things that you talked about. So, but part of that is because we live in a pluralistic society, a diverse society in which people hold different views on the preborn and when does life begin. All that. There needs to be a compromised approach in a diverse society.
Yeah.
Let's put that to one side. just within the Christian community, to those who would hold to a Christian ethic, as you've argued throughout this book, like on a number of other topics, you don't argue it's complicated. Like slavery is not complicated. The eradication of indigenous peoples is not complicated. The celebration of KKK grand wizards is not complicated. Like these are not morally ambiguous issues. And so like you mentioned again earlier in the book, this is a quote, the early Christians' value for life or even the potential of life before, during, and after birth was uncontested. And you quote Tertullian again, quote, in our case, murder being once for all forbidden, we may not destroy even the fetus in the womb. Like there is an ambiguity in the early church about these things. And obviously they didn't have the scientific knowledge that we have of when life begins. But the fact that we have greater scientific understanding of these things should, if anything, expand the ethic of life, not contract it. So what does it mean just within the Christian community if we really believe that all life is sacred and created in the image of God? Shouldn't that expand our ethic rather than contract it and saying, well, we need to make more and more and more exceptions?
Yeah, and this is where in the book I really point to Mother Teresa as a great example of this. I mean, she's, I got to work with her. She's a great inspiration for me. Interestingly enough, she's known for her passion for life on abortion. She was very passionate about it. In fact, I tried to bring a couple of kids back from India to a family in the United States that was going to adopt them. And she said, we are prioritizing folks that would be having an abortion in the United States to have that baby birthed and adopted. And we'll find Indian families for the kids who are here in India. So it was, she really wanted to create opportunities for adoption and alternatives to abortion. She was also not a single issue person. She would call governors the night before an execution and ask them to show mercy. And because she wasn't just about bumper stickers and T-shirts, but taking in 14-year-old pregnant women, girls, and walking alongside families in tough situations, creating economic stability for folks that didn't know how they would have it. Like that's what it meant to be pro-life for Mother Teresa. It wasn't cheap pro-life, like just, holding a sign. I think our deepest conviction should come with responsibility, which is why there's the reverberating question in Rethinking Life is, what does love require of us?
Right.
To me, that's more important than what do you believe? It's what does love require of us? And, even Mother Teresa was invited by Bill Clinton to the National Prayer Breakfast to speak, right? Because of that respect. So I think that's part of what we've got to get back to is centering what does love require of us and also having a better conversation with each other, even if we're coming at it from different directions.
Last question before I let you go. And the last third of the book, you talk about what do we do with this? How do we begin to rebuild a consistent ethic of life? And you have some great stuff in there about using your voice, telling the truth about our history, which we talked about already. And then you have this section about, well, what does it mean to vote? I mean, we unfortunately have inherited a system of a two-party government where neither one of them has a monopoly on this ethic of life. Explain a little bit, as you do in the book, how you approach the thought of voting, because so many people think that's the extent of their expression of their commitment to life. How do you see it differently?
I should just to be fully transparent, Skye, I know this is a safe place, is that I could not be more disappointed with our politicians. Kind of at all levels. And I think especially people even younger than me feel that disappointment at the Supreme Court, at the, electoral process, all levels, like our disappointment with politicians is like at an all-time high. And our confusion about, things like the Electoral College and why is the Supreme Court, like all this stuff. I think there's a lot of really good stuff that's being rethought. So this is where, and just with the Biden administration, to be fully transparent, is like, so Obama raised Bush's military budget, right? And then Trump raised Obama's military budget. And then Biden raised Trump's military budget. So we are spending $25,000 a second every single second on militarism. We have bombs that are 100 times stronger than the Hiroshima bomb, and we have 50,000 of them in our arsenal. So this is like, I don't think any Christian that, is really committed to life can say that that's okay. But this is not a partisan thing, right? Like when it comes to the death penalty, we're trying to get President Biden to tear down the federal death chamber, and it hasn't happened. So, I want to be really clear that there's that disappointment. So the way that I think of voting, Skye, is that we're not voting for a savior. We're doing harm reduction. We're doing damage control. We're trying to harness the things that are crushing people's lives. That may sound really cynical, but I think that's kind of where I'm at, is I'm voting for the person that's going to do the least amount of damage in the world. Some of that gets a little bit more substantial locally. Like when I think of the opioid crisis that's taken 1,200 lives a year in our city alone. But things like gun violence, things like the death penalty, a governor, it shouldn't be this way, but a governor single-handedly has the power to kill or not to kill. So in Pennsylvania, we have the death penalty. We just have a governor that's not going to execute anybody. So I think those are really important, all of these life questions to ask that. But another way of thinking about voting for me is, what does it look like to use my vote in solidarity to those whose lives are at stake? So in a sense, Jesus said, when you do it to the least of these, you do it unto me. What does it look like to vote for those who are hungry and those who are sick, those who are strangers and incarcerated, those who are really the most vulnerable in our society? What does it look like in the ballot to kind of cast our solidarity with those whose lives are at stake? So that, it's kind of another way. And at the end of the day, I think we got to be really clear. And this is where, our faith can be helpful, that our voice is not limited to a ballot box. We don't just make change happen once every 4 years or 2 years. Like, that's the radical politics of the early church, is that they were saying, when they said Jesus is Lord, they were saying Caesar is not. When they were declaring the kingdom of God, it was not just something we vote for, but it's something that we participate in every single day.
I couldn't have said it better. The challenge in all of that, of course, is I know sisters and brothers who are wrestling with exactly the questions you're asking and going into the ballot booth with a sense of damage control and casting their vote, believing that what they are doing is to advocate for those who cannot speak up for themselves. And a faithful Christian will vote one way and another faithful Christian will vote the other way. And that's what's so perplexing about this moment, is people of good conscience can fundamentally disagree in prioritizing their vote differently based on what issue it is of life that they think is most urgent. So there's no simple answers here. And that's part of the reason why people need to pick up your book, because I think you, in a really godly way, reveal and complicate the issue. I mean, you clarify it in the sense that here's the Christian ethic of life from the early church, from the scriptures. Here's where it went off track, and here's what it means to get it back. But the actual application of this in our world and in our lives is going to look different for different believers and different vocations and different callings. And you're the right person to speak on that because you've backed it up with your life and actions. And anyway, I can't recommend it enough. It's a great book, Rethinking Life, Embracing the Sacredness of Every Person. Shane, you are welcome here absolutely anytime. And there are so many issues that I would love to partner with you more on, because I believe in what you're doing. So thank you.
You too, man. It's so good to see you. And come to Philly sometime. I'll take you out for a cheesesteak, or you can come see the stadium where the Super Bowl was won.
All right, Shane, have a good one.
Awesome, brother. Yeah, good to talk, man.
Hey, everyone, it's Skye. I'm back with Phil Vischer and Christian Taylor to talk about the interview that they just listened to that I did with Shane Claiborne. So there's a lot here, guys. I'm curious, just top of your head, what stood out that you need to react to? Well, first of all, I'm going to
say he is an expert in his field. Clearly, if you haven't looked up Shane Claiborne, he certainly knows what he's talking about, and he has a very out-of-the-box way of viewing things, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah,
what about you, Phil?
He's been fun to have on the show in the past. My mother just recommended a book to me. I forget the name. I need to look it up, on basically some of the same stuff on how much the church changed with Constantine.
Yes.
Just in the quest for power. We're running an empire now, so we need to rethink some things versus pre-Constantinian Christian thought.
Yeah, and that's a part that I would love to have Shane back to talk more about, because we always look at the Constantinian thing as like a huge problem, that it changed the church dramatically. But to be fair, at some point, if Christianity kept growing, at some point there would be cities, communities, maybe countries or eventually empires that have a majority Christian population, in which case they do need to make decisions about policing and soldiering and taxing and all these other kinds of issues. So I don't want to say it's inherently wrong for Christians to have power, but it is very, very dangerous.
Yeah, and
that's where I felt like there was some disconnect.
I wonder how different it might have been if it hadn't happened so rapidly and through the office of Caesar in the Roman Empire versus more of a decentralized bubbling up of towns figuring out Christian governance, and then towns coming together and figuring out nation governance. Instead of, hey, we have the largest empire that there's ever existed, and now we're all going to convert to Christianity. Augustine, can you tell us how it works? And it's just a conversation with a couple of guys to figure it all out. I thought the quote, we've pre-Constantinian quote, we've become children of peace. We can no longer take up the sword against others.
Yeah, that was something I wanted to ask you both about. What did you think of Shane's basic? I mean, he's a pacifist, but when I asked him, can you be a police officer or can you be a soldier? And he kind of wavered on that a little bit, but I kind of heard him say, I'm not so sure that you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was incredibly interesting because it wasn't just policeman and soldier. It kind of goes, across the breadth of things that we shouldn't do if we're
lawyer arguing for the death penalty.
Yeah, or things we shouldn't be involved in, or I don't know.
Yeah, then you guys got crazy and started talking about my MacBook and stuff that you shouldn't be talking about.
Well, it's kind of like
and that was my point: is how far removed can you ever be?
You stop at my front door, Skye. That's where you stop.
But I wondered practically, so I have a son that's in the military. I have two of them. But one of them particularly feels like God made him to be in the military, to stand on the wall of, freedom or whatever. And he has this warrior mindset of wanting to be able to defend his country and what he believes is true and the people that he loves. And so he would... I think if he was to have a conversation with Shane, and he also loves Jesus, but if he was to have a conversation with Shane, that would be an interesting conversation. Because on the one hand, Hunter feels like he's called by God and created this way to be able to, to serve and to defend. And I don't think Shane would agree with that.
Right. I mean, it raises two different dilemmas. Let's say you're a soldier. One dilemma is what happens when your government, your commanding officer, your commander-in-chief, orders you to engage in an act of war that clearly is unjust or violates what we would call just war theory, the Augustinian view of war. What do you do then? And then the second issue, which is where Shane was, is, well, even if it's a just war, quote unquote, like it's World War II and you're going up against the Nazis who are clearly doing evil atrocities, I think he would say even then you're still taking up the sword. And as a Christian, you simply cannot do that. That's a strict pacifist view.
And that's the Quaker view or the Anabaptist view, which, So it's a long-standing Christian tradition. It's not something that Shane made up, or it's not something that completely disappeared with Constantine.
That was interesting of what he said about the early, writings or whatever, talking about abortion and those kinds of respecting life all the way from, early on. I didn't know those things. I was happy to learn them.
Well, and that's the other point that I tried to challenge him on a little bit was, okay, you have accurately depicted the view of the early church that you couldn't be a soldier, and you're applying that pretty clearly to modern settings. But then when he took the early church's writings about abortion, which are also clear, he gave a lot of wiggle room for the application of that
is true.
In our contemporaries. So that's where I was wondering, well, wait a minute, why aren't you as strict about why aren't you an abortion abolitionist the way you are a pacifist when it comes to policing and soldiering?
Yeah,
Well, maybe you need to have him back on.
Well, you tried to address it. I think it's an important conversation because of the number of people who argue for abortion abolitionism and will use it as analog to slavery. If you're going to compromise on abortion, would you compromise on slavery? And articulating the difference, is tricky if you're speaking in terms of absolutes. That if there really is no difference in taking a morning after pill to prevent, either prevent fertilization or to prevent a fertilized egg from implanting, in the uterus, if that really has the same moral evil as, strangling a 1-year-old, then the question is, how have you reached that point of view? And is that a surface reading of the Bible? Is it a plain reading of what text? How do we get from the Bible to a blastocyst needs to have the same legal protection as a 10-year-old, or we're compromising on God's word? That's where I keep getting tripped up in conversations, because if you question that, obviously, and we've talked about this before, if there's 10 embryos frozen in one room and then there's a newborn in another room and there's a fire in the hospital, almost everyone will instinctively save the newborn. Is that because there's a difference in value between an embryo and a newborn, or is it simply because we can't stand the thought of a newborn dying in a fire? That stuff is really hard to unpack.
Well,
go ahead, Christian.
Well, no, I was just going to say what was interesting was with the wiggle room that you're talking about, he basically said, we know things now that we did not know 2,000 years ago, which is what you're talking about, Phil. And that was where the wiggle room comes, but it really doesn't answer those questions very clearly
most people would say that's where the wiggle room leaves, because what we thought 2,000 years ago. Aquinas said there isn't really an issue with abortion until ensoulment, and ensoulment is when the soul goes into a developing fetus, which he believed happened for a boy at 40 days gestation and for a girl at 80 days gestation. Because at the time, the belief—
I've never heard of this.
Yes, because at the time it was believed that girls were underdeveloped boys. That's where women came from. It's from male embryos that didn't fully develop.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, which affected our view of women in the church, affected our view of women in all areas of life. So, so there was vagary, and that's why people came up with the quickening idea. It was like quickening is when the soul enters the baby and the baby comes to life. So it's a lesser crime to have an abortion pre-quickening. If you don't feel the baby isn't alive, the soul hasn't been deposited by God in the baby yet. So you shouldn't kill a child pre-quickening, but it's not a crime like it is if you do it post-quickening. And we know now scientifically that's all garbage, just nonsense.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of people are led to. So the only answer is absolutism. Complete abolitionism. And if you want to take a more nuanced position, well, defend your nuance and defend it biblically. And it's tricky.
Well, here's where I'll defend Shane, and I think his book is really, really helpful, is he shows, number one, that there is hypocrisy on all sides politically here, that there are certain issues on which each party does value life and others where they don't. And if you really care about the Christian ethic of life, you can't just lockstep move with one political party or the other. And then secondly, my big takeaway from his book, and I think this is where he was going on the chapter of abortion, we are called as Christians to value life, period. Full stop, like preborn life, elderly life, life that's different, life that's the same. We're supposed to value life. And then the question becomes, if we agree on that Christian ethic, then we need to have an honest conversation of what's the best way to do that. So when it comes to abortion, if we can all agree that the preborn matter, okay, we can agree. Now it's, well, what's the best way to protect more of those lives? And some would argue, well, we need to ban all abortions forever. Others would say, well, yeah, we need to change some of the legal stuff around abortion, but there's these other things that actually have proven to lower the abortion rate a lot more, which, we've talked about in previous episodes. So there's some wiggle room, but I think that same approach needs to be taken to things like soldiers in the military and policing. Like, if we care about life, there's a role for police in our society. And therefore, I don't know what other people think, but I feel better knowing that there are godly women and men in the police force rather than non-Christians entirely in the police force. And I would hope that they would have an influence in changing the way we police in this country so that it is more life-affirming, and perhaps we'd avoid some of the calamities and horrors that we've seen recently. So, but then there's other people who take a strict pacifist view that say, no, Christians can't do these roles at all, period. So there's room here to negotiate and cooperate in a diverse society, but can we at least agree on the ethic of life? And I think that's what Shane's book is really driving home, is frankly, when we put politics first, we don't agree that all lives and all stages of life matter. So that's an important conversation to have. But
there are some like really confusing nuances, and when I was listening to him talk about the soldier's point of view, I'm imagining it's the story I've shared before here about Hunter and his dilemma. He's standing there looking out of his outpost, and he sees this little boy that he's known every day for months now, about to be taken from some really bad guys. And what was the right thing to do in that moment? He felt the right thing to do in that moment was to take out the bad guys and let the little boy live. He wasn't given that authority or permission to do that, and so he's had to live with that the rest of his life. But I think according to Shane's argument, it would have been to do nothing. And I can't.
Actually, your story is actually a perfect illustration, I think, to speak for Shane a little bit. Just as Hunter, his commanding officers, had not given him the permission to execute those bad guys, I think what Shane would say is, hey, our ultimate commanding officer is Jesus Christ. And he has not given us the permission to take out bad guys either. Therefore, even if you're living in 1940 and the Nazis are on the march, as a Christian, you have not been given the authority to take life. So we
let them roll over us? We just...
Well, didn't Hunter have to let those bad guys take that little boy?
Well, he did, because he would have been like dishonorably discharged.
Exactly, and that's Shane's point, is if you do that as a Christian, you are dishonoring Jesus and you are not following his way. So you're trusting that your commanding officer has a bigger vision of what's happening and you submit to his authority. That's what Hunter did, and that's what a good soldier does. Shane is saying that's how the same mindset we need to have as Christians. And I'm not saying I'm not a pacifist, so I'm not making that argument exactly. I'm trying to speak on behalf of those who would. And I think there is, as Phil said, a long tradition of pacifism in Christianity that we need to wrestle with. I think that's a very legitimate theological position to hold, and we need to wrestle with it. And too often we just immediately dismiss it as illegitimate and can't possibly be what God's calling us to. I think it deserves more respect than that and needs to be wrestled with. And your illustration about Hunter in that moment illustrates it perfectly.
Okay, but to go one step further, if I am to let those bad guys take over, and I have the power to stop them, then I'm not respecting the life behind me.
But Hunter did have the power to stop them, and he didn't.
I'm stepping away a little bit from that. I'm just saying, let's think about the Nazis, right? Here we are, we know that if we let these guys run over this town, they're going to kill all of these people, abuse the women and children, take it over and make it their own. So if we don't stand on that doorstep and say, you're not going to go any further, like we can look at Ukraine and what we are seeing is really bad.
Yeah.
So isn't it, if you're not standing for those people, you don't care about that life?
You're getting to the core dilemma here. And the central question needs to be, what has Jesus called us to? And
it could be standing up for those that can't stand up for themselves.
Exactly. And that's where non-pacifists would argue, no, that there is a loving place for protecting the innocent, for defending the helpless, for limiting the advances of evil in the world. And I agree with that. But I think it's also that same ethic, the just war theory ethic has been used. We saw it as recently as 2003 in the arguments for invading Iraq. We have seen just war theory used in many abusive ways throughout history.
Yeah, on every side.
The only other thing that I thought was really interesting was just the idea, well, there are other things too, but this is the only other thing I'll mention, that proximity to power creates compromise in following Jesus. That is very hard. The closer we get to power, the more, is it unavoidable? Because this is a big question, I think, today with the Christian nationalist movement is, because we're following Jesus, we need to acquire more power so we can
we deserve it.
We deserve more power so we can ensure that his will is done. So that we have Christian laws and Christian behavior and, no drag queens and all of that. So, and someone has said that there seems to be in some of the Christian nationalist movement a complete loss of the notion of the depravity of man. That if you put someone in power because you think this guy will definitely use the power correctly.
Yeah.
You're almost going to be disappointed 100% of the time. Yeah. Historically,
it's a very naive view of humanity that, like we've talked about before, there's just good guys and bad guys, and as long as you have a good guy with power, then it's the good guy with a gun stops the bad guy with a gun. It's an incredibly naive view of humans.
So the argument has been made that the founding fathers set up the system the way they did partly because they believed in the depravity of man.
Right.
That no man should handle absolute power.
Because absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Absolutely.
Weren't we told that in school?
What we have now, though, is a lot of people, on the Christian right saying, but democracy is not the ideal. The ideal is either theocracy or a Christian Caesar. Literally, let's go back to Constantine. That's the ideal. Because then you can stop people from doing bad things.
Yeah, it's again incredibly naive. The ideal is a monarchy, but it's a monarchy in which Jesus is king, and he has eliminated all of his enemies and put everything under his feet, and he's even eliminated the enemies of death and evil and depravity, so that he can reign over a perfect people in a perfect kingdom. That's the ideal.
We need to get a head start.
We are not perfect. What's that?
We need to get a head start. We need to get started.
Right? Yeah, he needs our help.
Yeah, because it's going to take him a long time to take over all the nations. So if we could just take over Canada and maybe, Uruguay, then he could do the rest.
Or Hungary.
Hungary. I'm hungry.
Start there.
I'm really hungry.
Christian's hungry. All right. That was a great interview, Skye. Thanks for letting us listen to it.
Yeah, I like having Shane on. Thank you guys all for listening. Thanks for supporting the Holy Post. If you want more of this kind of stuff, be sure to go to holypost.com, click on the Support Us button. You can get all kinds of goodies there if you are a supporter. And we'll be back with more great news and interviews.
All right, see you guys.
Bye, everybody.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.